Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started shortly. Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome to the June 2024 edition of Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities. This is a monthly seminar series that is focusing on the impacts of climate change in cities and solutions to that problem. My name is Franco Montalto. I'm one of the co-investigators for the Consortium for Climate Risks in the Urban Northeast here, a multi-university consortium funded by NOAA. If you're joining us for the first time, CC-RUN has been hosting the seminar series going back almost a decade now. All of our previous webinars and this one as well are live cast, recorded, and archived on the CC-RUN website. We've just recently relaunched the CC-RUN website. We invite you to check it out and take a look at any of our previous presentations if you like what you're seeing today. As you may know, continuing education credits are available for professional engineers. If you register and attend the survey, and we send those out within a week of each of these webinars. We can go to the next slide. Before we get to today's special topic, I want to just take a moment. Let me advance the slide for a moment. Sorry, we're having a problem here. Whoops, sorry. Apologies. Okay, apologies for that. We will be hosting here at Drexel University by CC-RUN on Wednesday, July 10th, the authors of the recently released Northeast chapter of the National Climate Assessment, the 5th National Climate Assessment. And we'll have several of the authors of the Northeast chapter here to talk a little bit about some of the key messages and sort of thoughts from stakeholders in the region going forward about what might be included in the NCA 6 effort. That'll be in the morning session. The afternoon session will be geared towards local practitioners here in the Philadelphia region, and we'll have an interactive discussion section, including folks from the city of Philadelphia's climate resilience efforts. So we will, if for those of you who are interested in that, we will put links right now for the in-person and virtual attendance in the chat. This is again on July 10th. The morning session focusing on the region, the afternoon session focusing on the Northeast. We'll have a great we'll have a great keynote speaker as well. So we invite you to join us for that session. And moving on to today's topic, I'm excited to welcome researchers from Boston University's Center for Climate and Health. Boston University is part of CC-RUN, and these researchers will be presenting on bridging climate science and public health, big data, and case studies. Before I invite my CC-RUN colleague, Dr. Patricia Fabian, to introduce the speakers, I'd like to remind you to use the Q&A box, not the chat, to submit questions, and we'll have a brief Q&A after the initial presentations, and then we'll have smaller Q&A in between the case studies, time permitting. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Patricia to sort of kick off today's session.
Thank you, Franco. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. As Franco said, my name is Patricia Fabian. I am an associate professor at the Department of Environmental Health at Boston University, associate director of Institute for Global Sustainability, and work with this really great team of people at the Center for Climate and Health. So just a bit on kind of logistics of what we're going to all be presenting. There's going to be kind of the first hour, we're going to talk about different centers and research networks and data, big climate data. And we'll stop for discussion kind of in the middle. Then we'll have presentations from 4 different projects that kind of use a lot of the data and collaborate in the Center for Climate and Health. And as Franco said, we'll do kind of like 10-minute presentations and then 5 minutes for questions. Please use the question and answer feature here on the Zoom to kind of put things there, and then we'll pull the questions once it's time, once everybody finishes presenting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emma Gause.
Hello, everyone. Let me make sure this works. Hello, everyone. My name is Emma Gause, and I am a research scientist at the Center for Climate and Health at the Boston University School of Public Health. And my background is in spatial epidemiology, epidemiological methods, and substantively in firearm injury prevention, although I've since sort of migrated over to the climate and health side. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of climate data initiatives that we've been working on. And then I'll turn it over to a discussion. And then, as Patricia mentioned, we'll get into some case studies. So the Boston University School of Public Health has really been focused on climate and health research for several years. It's been a main focus of many of the researchers at the school. But in 2022, we launched the Center for Climate and Health to really focus a research program around climate and health. And I think I might have the honor of being the very first center-specific hire. So hopefully I represent the center well today. And the center has 3 main goals, which I'll touch on. The first and foremost is really community. So one of the main things that we're trying to do at BU is to bring together the community of climate and health researchers and really sort of provide a rallying point around which we can congregate and work in this space. And this involves bringing together not only researchers from the School of Public Health and the medical campus, but for those of you who are familiar with BU, the physically but not intellectually distant departments across campus, such as Earth and Environment and Data Science and Computing, for example, to really promote sort of interdisciplinary research that includes both health science, climate science, and everything in between. And I think one of the big successes we've had here in building this community is not just bringing together people who really sort of self-identify as climate and health researchers, but encouraging people who are sort of on the peripheral of this space to join in the community of practice that we're creating. And so these are people who may not self-identify as climate and health researchers, but really have a research question that is sort of firmly within the climate and health space, but maybe they don't have the background, the data, the expertise to sort of make that research question happen in a timely and effective way. And I think the way that we do that well is by lowering the barriers to entry to work in the climate and health space. And really, this is related to our third goal of speed, which I think I'll keep coming back to in this presentation. So the goal is really to accelerate the pace of research and translation for valid, good climate and health science. And we're trying to do that primarily by providing resources to make it easier for other people to do their climate and health research and work, including providing things like ready-to-use data, subject area consulting and methodological expertise to our center affiliates and partners to really accelerate the pace between the brainstorming of a research question and the time when you actually have data and code in front of you to try and attempt to answer that question. And I think I might be preaching to the choir in this group, but I like to use this example I think we're all probably familiar with climate data, but most climate data is free, publicly accessible, available to download from online. But just because it is available doesn't really mean it is accessible to everyone. So I love using this example. This is an example from a recent publication from one of our research scientists. It outlines the process that he underwent to create this daily county level population weighted file of temperature metrics for every CONUS county in the United States for the past 20 plus years. And that seems fairly simple, daily temperature data. But if you actually think about the process that it took to create this data set, there are a number of different metrics, all of which are big raster files, daily, sometimes raster files for 20 plus years, which you have to aggregate. Think about tricky things like time zones, climate regions to calculate valid heat indices like wet bulb globe temp, and then to aggregate to an administrative boundary that we could use for health analysis that is useful for health analysis, such as county levels, take into account population weighting, particularly for those large counties in the Western United States. We really want the temperature metrics to be where people live, work, and play, and not the top of a mountain, for example. And so the whole process took months, if not years, to get a final county level population weighted temperature data set for the past 20 plus years in the United States. And so just to emphasize, all of this data are publicly available, but it's so time and computationally intensive to prep it. It requires some software and skill sets that might not be common, that having someone who is an expert in this field create this really great data set has made it so much easier for us in the climate and health space to use the data, this great exposure assessment data, to accelerate our sort of research question to translation outcome product timeline. So this data has been used a number of times within our group and is also publicly available. So anyone with the link can also download and use it. And I think a great example of the success stories of having these building blocks available to us is a recent collaboration that we did with the Chicago Tribune, between the Center for Climate and Health and the Chicago Tribune. So a reporter at the Chicago Tribune reached out to the Center for Climate and Health and had a question about hot neighborhoods in Chicago. There was recently a new mayor elected. They're looking at the climate action plan, and they had a couple of questions that they needed answered, but they didn't necessarily have the data or the expertise to sort of create the metrics and the visualizations that they were looking for. So they reached out to the center. We were perfectly sort of capable or set up to turn around a publication-worthy product in about 1.5 months. One of our RAs worked with the Chicago Tribune reporter to create exactly what they needed. And this recent publication, I guess from last year, was published. And this sort of data dashboard about surface temperatures across Chicago is still being used today to sort of inform their local health climate action plan. So this is just to say, having these building blocks, creating these resources, lowering the barriers to entry allows us also to collaborate with non-academic or external partners, such as the media, who have quicker turnaround times. They're not on that academic research timeline. And so this is just a success story to emphasize sort of the benefit of making it easier for everyone to do climate and health research. Now, those are some internal BU initiatives, but the work that has been done at the BU Center for Climate, or the BU School of Public Health, particularly in the center, over the past several years, has really led beautifully into this new collaboration, the CAFE project, that is a joint BU and Harvard School of Public Health Research Coordinating Center funded by the NIH Climate Change and Health Initiative. And so this is not a research grant, it's a coordinating center, which I think some people might be unfamiliar with, but I think of it as sort of an infrastructure grant. So we're making it easier for people to do their work in climate and health. And the main goals of CAFE are really to convene, accelerate, foster, and expand the global climate change and health community. And there are a number of different sort of facets of this. I'm going to talk about the data management piece because that's where I sit. But if you scan this QR code, it will take you to the CAFE landing page that will have a lot of more information if you're interested. And certainly if you have any questions, one of us on the call will be able to answer. But generally, CAFE is going to provide a number of different resources, including ready-to-use, analysis-ready data sets, tutorials, code pipelines, seminars, webinars, conferences, and communication platforms really to bring together the entire global community of climate and health to promote those sort of peer-to-peer collaborations and conversations. So ultimately with the goal of making climate and health research easier, more valid, more accurate, better in all ways. Pretty lofty goals. But I'll focus on the data management feature or function within CAFE. And I really want to promote our Harvard Dataverse CAFE data repository collection. So this, we are working on creating a central repository for climate and health data. It is available now. If you go to the the Harvard Dataverse and search CAFE, you'll find it. You can also get there from the CAFE landing page that I shared in the QR code. And essentially, we're bringing together analysis-ready climate data sets that are appropriate for health analysis. So this is typically aggregated to some administrative boundary. And certainly us at CAFE and also members of the Center for Climate and Health at BU are creating data sets to put on the CAFE Dataverse repository, but we really want this to be an organic resource to grow organically from the community. And so we really encourage anyone on the call, if you have climate and health data that you'd like to share, this is a great place to do it. If you post your data on the Harvard Dataverse in our climate collection, you receive a DOI for that data set. It can be, used in publications. You can track or be accredited for the work that you do. Because I think everyone knows that 90% of a project is data management and only 10% is really like the analysis piece. So get credit for that 90% of your work, post it on the Harvard Dataverse in our CAFE climate collection, get that DOI and start promoting it. And other pieces of the data management function that we're working on now are code tutorials so that there is sort of standardized methods, transparency in some of the exposure assessment metrics for climate exposure data, and tutorials to help people prep their own data in a quicker way, reduce the duplication of efforts, and sort of coming back to this goal of speed, accelerating the pace of climate change and health research. And many more good things to come. If you are interested in following up, please go to the CAFE website and you can sign on to the listserv and stay updated for things that we're working on. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Greg, to talk about a special new initiative in CAFE.
Great, thank you, Emma, and hello, everybody. Thanks to CC Run for the invitation to be here today. My name is Greg Wellenius, and I'm a professor in the Department of Environmental Health at Boston University, and I also direct our Center for Climate and Health that Emma was just talking about. I'm one of the co-PIs of the CAFE Research Coordinating Center of the NIH Climate Change and Health Initiative that Emma also just talked about. And as an add-on piece to that, we're excited to announce a new program that leverages the substantial infrastructure from CAFE, but extends that into the world of geosciences. So CAFE is funded by NIH, and understandably, our focus in climate and health as funded by NIH has been primarily focused on the health side, but we recognize the incredible importance of a multidisciplinary approach to advancing the climate and health agenda, and that requires meaningful engagement between those that are expert in the health sciences and those that are expert in the geosciences. So we applied to NSF, the National Science Foundation, and we're delighted to have been recently funded to create a research coordination network, specifically to bridge this gap between those that are expert in geosciences or atmospheric sciences or earth sciences, and those with expertise in the health sciences, both of those fields writ large. And the idea here is to, again, build on the substantial infrastructure developed under CAFE to extend that programming to be of relevance to those folks in the geosciences, but then also under this RCN, or Research Coordination Network, to actually fund folks to meet in person and build those bridges directly between the health sciences and the geosciences. And so the model that we're going to be launching soon, so stay tuned, is as follows. Many of us in the health sciences routinely go to a series of conferences in the health sciences. So whether it be the annual meetings of the American Public Health Association, or the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology, or the American Thoracic Society. But we don't frequently go to meetings that are frequented by those in the geosciences, such as the American Geophysical Union annual meeting. And vice versa, earth and environmental scientists, geosciences broadly, tend to go to the AGU meeting or the meeting of the American Meteorologic Society, AMS, but tend not to frequent the health meetings. So what we want to do is encourage folks to participate in meetings of the other discipline. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So the idea will be to recruit each year over a 5-year period. We'll recruit cohorts and fund geoscientists to attend an additional health meeting that they might not otherwise go to, and recruit health scientists to attend a geosciences meeting that they might not otherwise attend, and with funding again from NSF. And so the idea there is that we will build these cohorts, offer substantial virtual offerings, but also then build physical in-person cohorts that attend each other's meetings and get to know each other. So we hope to be launching that program within the next several weeks, so stay tuned for that. Emma, back to you.
Yeah, I think now we'll break for any questions from the first part of the presentation, and I'll turn it over to Patricia to moderate.
Hi, everyone. So just a reminder to post your questions in the Q&A. I saw some people already posted. There's a couple specific questions that relate to the presentation, and then I have some others for discussion as kind of people post things. But Emma, the first question here is about the temperature estimates that Keith calculated and how they're for the mainland US, and whether there's data availability for Hawaii and Puerto Rico and other areas.
Yeah, that's a great question. At this time, no, and it's not for lack of interest. It is issues with the underlying satellite data. So the ERA5 land data that we used for this heat metrics data set that I used the example for is, I think, around 9-kilometer resolution, but that's at the equator. It differs a little more stretched out at the closer to the poles, like in Alaska. And we know that it doesn't do well in very coastal areas or islands or places surrounded by a lot of water because the temperature data from the satellite, especially at that 9-kilometer resolution, is not sort of good enough. The water messes everything up. So it is not for lack of interest. It is sort of scientifically, we didn't think that the estimates produced for those smaller coastal island areas would be valid. So unfortunately, that's a long way of saying no, but but not for lack of interest.
Great, thank you. There's a comment here about Philadelphia group doing, Lisa Hastings doing some identification of temperatures. I wonder how this correlates with the data and BU's anchor. And Franco, you've done work doing temperature as well. I feel like a lot of conversations we've had with, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, a lot of conversations we've been having in Boston with the Green Ribbon Commission and a Better City are that there's so many smaller efforts collecting temperature, and there's no central repository for that. So I think that's probably the case also for CC Run, right? Like Franco, you do work on that and what Lisa posted. There's probably a place, a centralized place that we should have.
Yeah, in fact, this ties into a question that I had too, which was if there, you've got sort of satellite derived data, but there's also all of this grassroots sort of on the ground data collection. And I wonder if in the cafe structure, there's an opportunity to sort of contribute these other types of data sources, or is it focused mainly on these sort of continental scale data sets?
So Emma, if you want, I can take a first crack at that and then let you chime in. So the idea of the cafe collection on the Harvard Dataverse is to create an ecosystem that enables and encourages sharing of data by whoever has it, to make it, as Emma said, to make it findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible. And when possible, also the code that was used to generate those data sets, kind of those analysis-ready data sets from oftentimes from much larger, more complicated, more extensive data sets. And so so the answer to the question of could we post other data? Absolutely. Really, it's an ecosystem, so anybody can post. We're not curating the data. We're not. We do minimal quality checks on it just to make sure that what's there is what people say is there. But we don't do, we don't maintain the data. We don't own the data. It's the producer of the data, fully owns the data and the responsibility for the data. So the goal here was that there's many curated data sets already that sort of have these kind of top-down decided collections of what variables or data sets are important and which ones are maybe better than others, and we thought that there's space for this sort of community resource and ecosystem where anybody can post anything. And so I posted the link a little bit earlier. There's, I think, maybe 26 different data sets that are already public, with more in the pipeline to be made public shortly. For instance, we're about to publish a paper where we've already uploaded the data to the Dataverse, and as soon as the paper becomes published, we'll just turn it on to the data that accompanies that paper to be public. And so that was really the goal here. And we welcome absolutely data at any scale. It can be national or global scale, or it can also be an intensive highly valuable data set at a much more local scale. Emma, did I capture that right?
Yes, that was exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah,
we would love any data. We love your data.
I wondered if I might also chime in really quickly to add one more point that I wanted to mention after Greg's response. Sorry, I haven't had a chance to introduce myself. I will be talking a little bit later about a different project in the case study, but I'm Amrita Nori Sarma, and I'm an assistant professor in the environmental health department, also at BUSPH, and I'm one of the other MPIs of the CAFE project. And I just wanted to highlight a very important point that Emma made earlier in her presentation of the CAFE Dataverse resource, which is that in addition to having the opportunity for this data resource, investigators who are contributors to the CAFE also have an opportunity through the DOI and through ongoing citation of their resource to continue to receive acknowledgement for all of the work that goes into creating those highly localized data resources. So hopefully that provides also another benefit to researchers who want to contribute their data resources to this infrastructure. I just wanted to highlight that point again.
Thank you. Really great point.
Emma, I was going to return to you to see if you could elaborate a little bit on how people can work with all the different data sets. So we talked about like BU internal data, the cafe data? Can you maybe elaborate a little bit more on what is sort of there for downloading? What is something that requires, what does it require to kind of work with, et cetera?
Yeah, I think for this group, probably the most useful resource is going to be the cafe website, including access to the cafe Dataverse, the cafe community of practice communication platforms. We're on Slack and LinkedIn and a number of things to promote those peer conversations. I think that allows for broader collaborations, not just with us at BU, but with the wider community of practice. That's really what we're promoting, I think. But that being said, we do quite a bit of research at BU School of Public Health on climate and health. So many of the data resources we use internally will be available on the Cafe Dataverse, but we do have some sort of internal expertise and data that we might be able to collaborate more formally with people on the call, either interested students or through a co-grant, application, things like that. And certainly community partners, media. There's a lot of bandwidth, I think, for very quick turnaround, small projects that are requested or needed, desired by the community, that we could, leverage some of our building blocks and execute in a short turnaround. But definitely, if interested, reach out and we can take it from there.
Thank you. A related question was posted that if someone is interested in using the data from the Harvard Dataverse, can they ask questions of the originators of the data?
Yes, great question. So I think yes and no, but I'll give you more detail because that's unsatisfying. There's a lot of work that we're doing now to sort of ensure that the metadata and data documentation that is available with any data set that is submitted to the Cafe Dataverse is complete, and anything that I would want to know about the data before I used it, hopefully we're going to ensure there's a place for people to document there. So one, hopefully most of the questions that you have will be able to be answered. Two, because the data source is going to be nicely cited with a DOI and an uploader, anyone who, I think you'll be able to see who posted the data to reach out to them. Some of the data will be coming directly from our team at Cafe, and certainly there's communication platforms for people to ask questions. I don't know, we're not giving like one-to-one consultation in the long run, but in the short term, as we get things going, I think definitely people would be interested in chatting. So feel free to reach out. Not all the data there is going to be managed, as Greg said, by the Cafe team, but hopefully we're putting the building blocks in place to make sure that if you have a question, it should be in the metadata somewhere.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I think just to build on that for a second, Patricia, is that the metadata, we expect to be helpful. Many of the data sets have already been used in publications, often created, for a first publication. And so we encourage people to check out the literature cited as well. And then, in addition to sort of our different roles on Cafe, we are all independent researchers. And so I know many of the people that are depositing data in the Dataverse welcome collaborations and would be happy to talk to people for that. But again, sort of not as part of our Cafe infrastructure as a formal service, but rather each of us as independent researchers as we would have before Cafe existed.
Thank you. Greg, since I've got you chatting, can you maybe, Emma talked a lot about the data side of Cafe. Could I maybe have you talk a bit more about the other aspects of Cafe that might be interesting for this particular audience?
Yeah, that's great. So, thank you for the opportunity. So two other areas that we spend a lot of effort on is one is the capacity building side. That's the sort of the expand in Cafe. And as one recent example of an effort that is ongoing right now is that CAFE supported a scholarship program to enable 10 early stage investigators to participate in Columbia's Climate and Health Boot Camp. We thought the Climate and Health Boot Camp that Columbia puts on is a fantastic way to help early stage investigators get more comfortable with the literature, make the connections, understand the complexity of the problem. And we wanted to enable people that might not otherwise be able to attend to do so, including folks from minority serving institutions. We also have a pilot program that is, I think the finalists of that are being notified or about to be notified shortly. So we're very excited about releasing pilot project funds, again, provided by NIH to support new work in this area. So lots of efforts around capacity building. There's a approximately monthly webinar series that we call Cafe University. So again, lots of efforts around capacity building. The foster component is really facilitating the sharing of expertise. So there's lots of experts, but those experts don't necessarily know how to reach each other or have sort of peer-to-peer dialogue. We also hope to accelerate the pace of research translation. So lots of great research is already being done. How can we make sure that work is disseminated and actually designed up front in a way that is most useful and most actionable? And so we have a series of efforts, including right now, they're taking applications for a research translation lab, where again, we're building cohorts of individuals that are looking to engage more in research translation writ large. And we have several more programs currently under development in that, including figuring out how to support sort of specific components of the global community of practice. So around either a geographic area or a particular research theme, climate and mental health might be an area where we say, hey, we really want to gather, help convene and support the community of practice that's interested in this specific area, which might have different needs than a different area. So those are just some examples. So again, check out the website and follow us on LinkedIn or Instagram as your preference, and stay tuned for more announcements.
Great, thank you. Franco, do you want to ask the question?
Yeah, sure. I was really excited about the possibility of taking health researchers to AGU and geoscience researchers to a medical or a health related conference. I'm wondering, just because I know AGU abstracts or AGU sessions are being developed now, are there sessions that is it just sort of inviting these folks to attend these conferences, or are you also actively creating sessions for collaborative research between health and geoscience researchers?
Thank you, Franco. That's a great question. And in a second, I'll invite my close colleague, Lucy Hutyra, who I see joined the call. And she's one of the co-PIs on the Geo Cafe, along with Dan Lee, both of them at Boston University in the Department of Earth and Environment. And the idea behind that is that in addition to sending sort of these individuals, we'd also host events that would help convene the community. So using AGU as the example, we have submitted a proposal in collaboration with Susan Annenberg at George Washington University and Daniel Tong, George Mason, who are the current and next leader of the GeoHealth section of AGU, to create a networking event on one of the evenings where we can bring together the climate and health community. So these will be health scientists and geoscientists attending AGU and interested and open to anybody. So that's one example of the type of session we hope to promote for networking and community building around this area. We hope to do something similar at the annual meeting of the American Public Health Association, and working on other events with a longer runway. Lucy, did you want to add anything?
I think I haven't figured out how to turn on my video, but I think you covered it really well, Greg. Where this award was just put in place, and so a lot of the infrastructure around communication and outreach we are just starting to put together now. But I think Greg nicely covered what the vision and hope for the program is.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question, kind of again for this crowd. Can anybody be a participant in kind of these cohorts of being a climate expert, connecting with the research translation policy? How does that work?
To be determined, so only because we haven't totally flushed it out, so I don't want to make any promises that then we have to go back on. The idea is broadly to engage researchers with a particular interest I mean across the spectrum of early stage to established investigators that really want to work across disciplinary boundaries that we tend to preferentially silo ourselves and collaborate with those in our own discipline. So really interested in fostering those cross-disciplinary collaborations. The details let me not promise upfront.
That sounds good. I'm actually going to bring us back to data. And just, Emma, can you talk a bit more? You talked about heat, county level heat, but just kind of, can you broaden out the list of things that are in the climate data set, plan for the climate data set, both kind of type of climate data, and then also resolution that kind of links to health?
Yeah. First, I'm going to make a plug that hopefully it will be anything that our community of practice wants to upload. So we are not, allowing or disallowing any sort of specific type aggregation, resolution, et cetera. So climate and health research is what the community of climate and health researchers say it is. But I can say that I can give a couple examples of data sets that I believe are already up on the CAFE Dataverse collection. Air pollution is a big one. I think we have a wildfire exposure data set that has been downloaded 100 or more times already. We're working on potentially getting sort of synthetic health data sets, like a fake health data, but that follows sort of existing underlying population strata, because we know that HIPAA prevents sharing of actual small number, small area health data. So sort of synthetic health data sets that might allow people to test out code and analysis before actually receiving their health data. There's some work on flooding, drought, temperature, extreme heat, different heat indices. I'm sure I'm missing a couple. Greenness, a couple important ones. And then within sort of the topical thematic areas, one of the main goals is to make climate exposure assessment data available for health research. So a lot of these gridded satellite data sets we're working on aggregating at a number of different scales. So at the census tract, at the zip code level, ZICTA level, at the county level, so that whatever scale your health data is in, hopefully there's either an analysis ready data set at that same scale, or we've posted code that you can quickly, easily, hopefully, just take that code, change the aggregation of the geography and prep a derivative data set yourself with little effort, not known effort, but easier to sort of create those other derivatives at different geographies. So that's the goal. And we actually just did a big survey of climate and health researchers. Some of you on the call may have received it. Thank you if you've responded. But we're looking to see what climate and health data is available, what file types, what resolution, what temporal and spatial aggregations people are interested in. So hopefully we're going to be publishing the results of that survey in the near future. So to sort of make it very transparent, what exists in the climate and health space right now and what is needed, what is desired by the community. So hopefully we'll be able to make strides in those areas.
Great, thank you. There's a question in the chat. Have you worked with other environmental databases, i.e. Neotoma? And I'm not actually familiar with what that data set is.
Yeah, I don't know Neotoma either. Again, sort of going back to our earlier point that this is really meant to provide an ecosystem where anybody can share the data that they've produced or curated rather than us top down. So, in those data sets that Emma just went through, the wildfire smoke came out of Stanford and Marshall Burke's group there, the work that she showed that Keith Spangler led on the heat metrics package, integrated data from a number of sources to be able to create, calculate or estimate variables like wet bulb globe temperature, which require multiple variables coming in. And then he also published an R package so that you can calculate those metrics from your own data sources if you so choose. So there's not like one database that we're pulling from. We're really sort of trying to pull from a variety of databases. I think Pat Kinney, also at BU with Jen Stoll, uploaded a database that they used for the Lancet countdown on green, sort of average green space measured by NDVI from satellite in something like 1,000 cities across the world. So it really, the data there reflect the data that the ecosystem wants to share and make public.
Great, thank you. Pulling another question from the chat. This is recognizing that these data are more for academic researchers. Does CAFE include data that might better help develop and implement climate mitigation and resilience policies? For example, energy use to identify people without air conditioning, transportation data, etc.
I'll take the liberty of jumping in and saying that the next two presentations will touch on exactly that.
Okay. And there's a question about how to join the community of practice. Amrita, did you want to answer?
Sorry, yes, I was trying to type an answer. I apologize. I was just going to put in the link for the intake form. I can put that into the chat as well.
Great, thank you. And it looks like there's people typing answers to the other questions as posted. So maybe I'll give 30 seconds for anybody else to chime in with questions. And if there's nothing else, then I'll thank this first set of panelists. We're going to actually still talk in the second piece, but thank you very much for really informative conversation. And we had some nice comments in the chat from attendees. Okay, there's one last question, and then we're going to switch over to the case studies. This is someone saying they attended to talk about climate risk and public health, which pointed to important political structure, infrastructure, for example, redlining and gerrymandering, wondering if anybody on this group is thinking of gathering data for something like that. So I'll take a stab at answering that, because we actually had a National Environmental Health Disparities Center for 5 years that was funded by NIH and EPA. John Levy was actually co-director of that. And we collected all of that information around different markers of disparities, of structural racism. And so those are data sets that we already have from that center, and that obviously we then use for the climate and health research as well. Franco, looks like you want to jump in.
No. I just said you were answering it live. Go ahead.
Oh, I see. Okay. The name shows up. John, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think that covered the bases well. I mean, broadly, developing a lot of different geospatial layers that are relevant, and I think a lot of aspects of the built environment, redlining, geospatial data sets, all of those weave in with some of the other stressors that Emma and other presented earlier. And I think that, it's a great point. I think that's part of the richness of some of these geospatial data sets. And as I mentioned in the Q&A, I'll talk a little about the synthetic health population data in a minute, but I think it all just intersects in getting better sociodemographics and then getting better sense of things like, redlining or other measures of structural discrimination as key underlying data sets.
Okay, and with that, I'm going to, I think, move us to the second portion of the talk, which is really case studies, leveraging a lot of these data sets that we've been talking about. So I'll turn it over to Greg. I think you're going first, right? And Emma, maybe you can share the slide deck. And so just a reminder for those who arrived late, as kind of slides are getting pulled up, etc. We're going to do 4 different case studies of kind of different climate and health, energy, synthetic population projects that we have going on at BU. And we'll do maybe like around 8-10 minute presentations and then 5 minutes for questions, and then till we get to kind of about less than an hour, I would say. Great.
Okay, sounds great. And you can see my slides, okay? Okay, great. Thank you. So yeah, so I wanted to, just give you an overview of how we use some of these really large data sets to inform public health. And of course, there's this very well-established, highly well-documented association between temperature and relative risk of mortality. And what you could see is that as we deviate from some optimal temperature at which we observe the lowest rates of mortality, as it gets hotter than that, more people die, and as it gets colder than that, more people die. And importantly, this relationship is really different in different parts of the world. So even different cities within the same country, but in different climate zones, different vulnerabilities, different infrastructure. And this has been shown, using these set of methods advanced by Antonio Gasparini, almost a decade now. This has been shown in, I think something like 65 countries across the world, 1,000 cities or so. So very consistent that we see a relationship, although the shape of that relationship seems to vary across locations. So one of the questions I asked early on in my work in this space was, how can we use that type of approach and those type of data to answer questions that are locally actionable? So knowing how many people die of extreme heat or extreme cold in the world or in the country is not actionable at the local level. And this type of thinking really came about because the Rhode Island Department of Health, I was working at Brown University at the time, they came to me and said, how many people die of extreme heat in Rhode Island? I sort of through conversations, we determined that this was obviously a number we should be able to estimate if only we had the right data. And they were having conversations with the departments of health in Maine and New Hampshire, and to some extent Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut as well. So throughout New England, and saying, well, how many people die? Can we put a number on that? And so we came up with a way of doing this distributed analysis, so nobody had to share their data, but everybody could do the analysis locally, and then we could pool the data across these 15 cities in 3 different states. And we found what we expected was that here we did it with respect to heat index, which combines temperature and humidity, and saw that as days of summertime heat index went up, more people were admitted to the emergency room and more people died. And we could actually, quantify the relationship specifically for those sites. And then we could even format this information rather than showing, a curve or showing a relative risk. We could actually formulate that answer in terms of an actual number. Like, so on all the days where the heat index exceeded 100 degrees, how many people in this population, how many excess deaths were there? There were about 39 excess deaths on all those days, or maybe, emergency department visits, or maybe another 4 to 8 excess deaths. But if you go down to days with a heat index of at or above 95 degrees, those numbers get much bigger. So we were able to share this information with the National Weather Service, and the National Weather Service Office for the New England region looked at these and other data, and through conversations and partnership with the departments of health across those states, decided to change the threshold at which heat advisories were issued by the local National Weather Service offices. So again, as you probably all know, the NOAA directs that provides guidelines for how to issue heat warnings and heat advisories, but they encourage each regional office to develop their own more nuanced protocol based on local conditions and local knowledge. So that felt like a major victory, but then that led us to a series of studies on looking at the effectiveness of heat warnings. So if you tell people that it's going to be really hot tomorrow, does that or the actions associated with that heat warning or heat alert how does that change people's risk? And there was actually not very much data on this at the time. So we did a series of studies. The first one early on was based with some older data on deaths from 2001 to 2006 in the 20 cities that across the country that issued the most heat warnings. And just as we were learning to do this type of work. And interestingly, overall, we saw that during this time period, comparing a day with a heat warning to a day that was about as hot but didn't have a heat warning, there did not seem to be a mortality benefit. So, the conclusion from that was a little bit surprising, but we didn't see a mortality benefit associated with the heat warning. In other words, it did not look like issuing more heat warnings would lead to fewer people dying of extreme heat. Lots of problems with that analysis, including that it was only 20 cities and during a limited time frame where not that many cities were being very proactive about heat management or heat health management. So we repeated that study using a longer time frame and across the whole country. And now this is in the Medicare population. So this is deaths among Medicare beneficiaries and hospitalizations. Interestingly, the main result is still null. So this is that 1.005. This is essentially consistent with the null hypothesis that heat warnings are not associated with a reduction in mortality on the same day. Again, comparing 2 days that are equally hot, one with a heat warning, one that isn't. But we do see a small increase in the rates of hospitalization for heat stroke and fluid and electrolyte disorders, suggesting that it's not necessarily that we're seeing a reduction in mortality, but we maybe are reaching people, and instead of people suffering alone, actually proactively seeking medical attention on those days. Another type of sort of actionable insight that we think we can provide is, maybe heat warnings aren't as effective as they could be because we're not using the right trigger or the optimal trigger to issue those heat warnings. So most of the US bases the heat alerts on the forecast heat index, but there's other options. They could be based on temperature, wet bulb globe temperature, the Universal Thermal Climate Index, or Comfort Index, sorry, which Canada tends to use. And so we decided to just do a head-to-head comparison. You can see in blue the mortality, relative risk of death, comparing the 99th percentile to, I believe, the 75th percentile of summertime temperatures, and similarly for hospitalizations. And the good news is that any of these metrics are somewhat predictive of morbidity or mortality. The bad news is that no one index seems to do phenomenally better than any other. And if you look regionally at different parts of the country, which index does better varies from region to region. So it doesn't seem like there's an opportunity to do much better in terms of which index to use. But again, this is just in the Medicare population. We need to look in other populations as well. One of the things we've done in other populations is this is the work we've done in the Optum Labs data warehouse, which is about 130 million individuals over time, individuals with health insurance, and this is their healthcare claims. And you can see on the right that these are mostly located in urban areas. That's where you'd expect the population to be, and it's not this reflects the market share of the insurance companies that health insurance companies that participate in the Optum Labs program. On the left, of course, you see the temperature data. This was Keith Spangler's data set that is now publicly available for having those county-specific temperature metrics. And you see what you'd expect to see, but this is interesting because this is now an all ages population ranging from 0 to 100 plus. And so you see that as we have here, we're using percentiles of warm season temperature to allow comparison between locations that have very different weather, and the relative risk of emergency department visits for all causes, for heat-related diseases like heat stroke and dehydration, or for a series of other causes, several of which are related to local temperature. One of the interesting things we can do with such a large data set is really look in detail at the factors for susceptibility. So how does this risk of heat-related illness vary across age groups. You can see the excess relative risk here as a percent across age groups in this population. It does vary a little bit. It varies statistically significantly, but this sort of is in contrast to the mantra that we hear often that the elderly are at particular risk, as if the rest of the population is not. In fact, what this shows is that, in fact, at every age group we looked at, there was this excess risk, both in a relative sense and an absolute sense. We also see a substantial risk in both sexes, and whether, for some of the participants, we knew about a low income status if they receive certain extra benefits. And while the risk varies a little bit between those two groups, again, it's not fair to say that these effects are limited to any one group of the population. I won't dwell on it, but we did similar studies in kids. This is using data from a network of children's hospitals across the US, 47 children's hospitals. And again, with such large data, one of the things you can do is look for different causes of emergency department visits. And so heat-related illness pops up, but a number of other things that you might not have expected to be related to heat health in kids, like otitis media, this is ear infections, or blood and immune disorders. We're not necessarily sure what each of these means, but it's really interesting to be able to look in that context to say, what are people suffering from on days of extreme heat beyond the obvious of heat-related disorders? And finally, we can look at the consequences of individual events. This is, of course, a heat dome of 2021 in Seattle and Portland. And what was the impact on emergency department visits? Now, remember, everybody in this data set has health insurance, employer-provided health insurance. And even in that setting, you can see that there's a substantial increase, although it varies by city, in some of the heat codes. So these ones of sort of exposures due to heat that are very specific to excess heat, you see a large increase in the rate, now expressed as an incidence rate ratio, although you don't see a difference in all cause. So the narrative that there were so many more people going to the emergency room that might have been anecdotally true in this population of people with health insurance, we didn't see that all-cause ED visits went up, although heat-related, heat-specific ED visits did go up. Just an example of the type of work we can do. Similar types of approaches can be used. We've published on billion-dollar disasters as classified by NOAA, hurricanes and asthma exacerbations in kids with asthma, which turned out to be null, but it's still good work and publishable. We can look at PM 2.5, either overall, or we're doing some work with prescribed fires, doing heat and air pollution work in India, so it's not just US based. And then thinking a lot about climate and health equity and how you use data to illuminate, the possibilities. And that's funded through our Hariri Institute for Data Sciences internally to BU. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Greg. Lots to think about. There's a couple questions here in the chat that I think we can cover in a couple minutes, 2-3 minutes. So one is a question about the adult study of heat and health outcomes, and whether it takes into account demographics such as stable housing or people being homeless. And the question is wondering if preventing these deaths would be most effective by supporting homeless communities and individuals.
Yeah, it's a super good point. So we don't have any information on who is experiencing homelessness at this period, or the type of housing that they live in, either the quality or the stability of that housing. So one of the main limitations of these very large data sets is that you know relatively little about a phenomenal number of people. And the flip side is that there are some data sets that, and I can talk a little bit about that, where we have better data on, or more data, more extensive data, but on far fewer individuals. And since these impacts are very important and large at a population scale, but the individual relative risk is relatively small, it becomes really, it's always that balance of how you need a data set that's big enough to ask the questions that you want to do. So completely great comment that we're limited in terms of, the vulnerability factors are the individual ones that are measured are very few, mostly dealing with past medical history. And then we can link to census data and other data, spatial data on social determinants of health at the community level. level. All this work was done at the county level, so looking at social determinants of health at the county level is admittedly crude.
Thank you. And the second question is about death certificates and kind of the limitations of how they don't really record that the reason for death was heat. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, it's a great point. I've enjoyed hearing that reporting from NPR and other outlets, and I've talked to a couple of reporters about it, and it's a huge problem. So the difference there's about an order of magnitude difference in the number of people that on their death certificate have listed heat as a contributing cause versus the number of people we estimate as statistical excess deaths due to heat. And I think that question was sort of really hard to explain a few years ago, but now in the setting of COVID, I think people understand that not everybody for which COVID, is listed as a contributing cause of death, that underestimates the total number of excess deaths attributable to COVID. And so the challenge with looking at the statistical excess deaths is it gives you a number, but it doesn't tell you who in the population are those deaths. So if we say 10,000 people a year are dying excess deaths due to heat, it doesn't tell us which of the 10,000. Whereas in the death certificate data, it says this person, we think heat was a contributing cause. It tells you probably gets the total number wrong, but it tells you specifically who are. So strengths and weaknesses of both approaches. It's a super important point, and the ideal would be to develop national guidelines for reporting on heat-related deaths.
Okay. Thank you. So that's good timing. I think I'm going to move us. Someone else posted, but I'm going to save that question if you have time at the end, so we can keep us moving. So maybe John and Amrutha are up next, and Emma, if you can share the slides, thank you. And Amrutha, I know you introduced yourself already, but maybe John, you can introduce yourself, and then you guys can jump in.
I'll just introduce myself while we're getting to our slides. So I'm John Levy. I'm professor and chair of the Environmental Health Department here at BU, and I co-lead this project along with Amrutha, who I think will start our presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm really glad to be sharing our ACRES project with you today as one of the case studies that we're presenting on the intersection of climate and health and data resources. Emma, you can go to the next slide. So the ACRES project was funded by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency through a 3-year EPA STAR grant. It is a collaboration between the fantastic team of researchers that we have at Boston University School of Public Health and our community colleagues, Julie Wormser and Mariangeli Echevarria Ramos, who are from the Mystic River Watershed Association. And ACRES is a project looking at advancing community resilience to cumulative stressors, both climate-related as well as chemical, in the Mystic River Watershed, which is the greater Boston area, 21 different cities along the Mystic River Watershed that experience a wide array of different climate concerns as well as chemical stressors in the Boston area. Next slide. So I wanted to share with you some of the different data resources that our team has been working on within the ACRES project. And one of the things that you'll notice is that there's a lot of synergy with the data resources that Emma was mentioning previously, as well as some of the CAFE data resources that we've been working on getting up and running. So the primary motivation for the different data resources that we've been pulling together for the ACRES project, I guess I would describe it as twofold. The first is that because this is a partnership between the academic community and the different community organizations that are represented in the Mystic River Watershed, what we've really been aiming to do is identify the priorities that are top-level concerns within the different communities that are represented in the watershed region and provide access to data resources that the communities can then take to facilitate the solutions that they would like to advocate for within their own cities and within their own communities in order to become more resilient in the face of different climate and chemical stressors. So a large component of our project has actually been the community engagement piece, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, which has informed the collection of these different data resources that we've been working on. And so what you'll see here is basically a list of all of the different exposure data that are associated with climate and chemical stressors that we've been collecting and developing into very local, highly localized spatial and temporal resolution data sets within the watershed. And eventually what we would like to do is evaluate the impacts of each of these different exposures, including, for example, PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, other types of ambient pollutants, different measures of meteorology, including temperature as well as precipitation. And then novel for our group is that we're also focused on flooding as an area of primary concern that was identified within these communities, and flooding in terms of different historical measures of flooding, as well as potential flooding on different timescales that might occur in the future as a result of ongoing climatic changes. And then one of the things that I think was a question that came up in one of the previous presentations is that we're also looking at different types of sociodemographic characteristics that might also be predictors of vulnerability to adverse health outcomes in this region. So we're at the stage of completing the development of some of these data resources within the watershed, and we're going to be moving forward with presenting information on the environmental stressors that are of concern within the communities, as well as linking these to different health data resources in the next stages of our project. Next slide, please. So one of the other components that I think is really important that we've been working on within the ACRES project is that it's not just about creating the data resources and making it usable on the academic side. It's also about creating data resources that the communities can interface with. So we've heard a lot of different feedback from our community stakeholders through different conversations that we've had. Last week, we led a workshop with municipal planners from different communities in the region and provided them with preliminary looks at our data visualization tools that we're bringing up online, as well as providing a perspective on existing data resources, interactive data visualization resources that are already available that look at different climate hazards and chemical stressors in the region. And one of the pieces of feedback that we've actually received is that these types of mapping tools are very, very helpful for city planners and for municipalities as they're making their decisions regarding how to allocate resources for their communities. But the other component that they've mentioned would be really helpful is some perspective about what communities and residents are actually experiencing on the ground in connection with the different stressors that are of concern from the epidemiologic perspective. So a couple of different pieces of data that I mentioned before that have actually come directly from those engagements with our community stakeholders is that the communities are the ones that identified historic flooding exposures as a really big area of concern. And so now we're following up by developing access to data resources on historical flooding, and also understanding what different measures of flooding might yield in terms of the areas that are most prone to flooding or are most vulnerable to inland flooding as well as coastal flooding. Another idea that came up from community conversations was a group of doctors in Boston mentioned that they were concerned about their patients who were reliant on durable medical equipment and what would happen to those patients if they were suffering from extended periods of blackouts. And so as a result of that, there's an ongoing project to try to quantify exposure to blackouts across Massachusetts. And one of the things that we're hoping to do is to look at how the interaction between climate-related hazards and blackouts might further serve to exacerbate people's health outcomes associated with these climate stressors. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand it over to John to talk a little bit about the synthetic population work that we're doing as a part of the ACRES project as well.
Thanks, and I'll be brief. You can see that we have a pretty wide array of high-resolution geospatial data, which provides a really good foundation for the work. But there are limits, and the excellent question came up earlier, for example, about high-resolution health data that are rarely available. And so we've taken an approach, both in ACRES and in some past studies, to generate synthetic population data, which is basically getting extensive sociodemographic data with high resolution geographic assignment, which you can then use as the foundation for a host of different things. You can use that to predict health outcomes, which we've done in the past. You can predict exposures, behaviors that might be modifiers of health risks. And so we view this as an important element for environmental justice analyses, or just broadly for geographically targeted interventions in the space of cumulative climate and chemical stressors. So time doesn't permit to get into the details. I have just a little flash on it, but essentially it involves combining different strands of data from the census to yield this synthetic population. One of the things we're doing within acres that goes beyond what we've done in the past is trying to get even more geographically resolved and actually getting the households in this data set not just assigned to census tracts or block groups, but actually probabilistically assigned to parcels, which could then open up the door to understanding how sociodemographics correlate with building attributes or other things that are available at very fine geographic resolution, which we think could open the door to a number of different analyses. Next slide, please. I won't talk on these details. I know there's a lot of words and small details. This is just for background and folks' edification, that really what we're doing is pulling together different threads of data from the census, combining them to yield this synthetic population. This was our original work a decade or so ago, and it's been sequentially refined in some of the work in acres, kind of taking it to the next generation on the methods. Next slide. And so what that ultimately gives you, again, is the ability to geolocate populations in a very precise way. What you can see on the left is sort of the two different strategies that one could use. You randomly allocated basically takes the households and drops them into a census tract somewhat randomly. The bottom one does this parcel matching that I mentioned earlier, and you get some slight differences in the spatial assignment of where households are, which when you have very spatially heterogeneous exposures like heat, for example, or flooding, could make the difference in conclusions about health outcomes or about environmental justice implications. So the map on the right is just one of our many data layers within acres. This one, I know it's a little blurry, but it's looking at air temperature and reinforcing that kind of to the eastern side of the domain, where you have a lot of the communities that have relatively little green space, kind of high impervious surface, you have much higher concentrations. And if we can intersect that in a much more refined way with population data, again, we can get much more refined policy analyses. So I'll tag back into Amrita for the last few slides.
Great. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is that, and I've talked about this a little bit in the earlier slides, but we are also interested in running some epidemiologic analyses to connect the different climate variables or exposure data sets that we have as part of the ACRES project with different health outcomes. We have a couple of different health data resources that have already been discussed. In addition to some of the other health data resources specific to acres, we're interested in looking at hospitalizations among Medicaid beneficiaries. One of the primary components of the ACRES project is that we are really focused on who are the most vulnerable populations within these different communities. And so I think that this is a really good opportunity to try and identify the relationship between environmental exposures and health outcomes among populations with public health insurance in the region. We also have some preliminary work that's been done looking at psychiatric emergencies within the greater Boston area through another collaboration that I've been building out with Boston Medical Center, which is one of our safety net hospitals and provides access to psychiatric emergency services for patients who are on public insurance or patients who don't have access to health insurance in the area. And then finally, we're working on building out a collaboration to look at some of these environmental exposures and their impacts on health within all payer hospitalization data across the state of Massachusetts. A lot of the different exposure data resources we're developing are not limited to the Boston region or to the Mystic River watershed. And we think that there's an opportunity to look more broadly across New England or across the state of Massachusetts in order to increase our sample size on the health side and start to understand the relationship between these climate-related exposures and the health outcomes that we're really interested in. So I think I'll stop there. Happy to answer any questions. We've started to answer a few of the questions. Oh, sorry, I did want to also mention the community engagement as the last key component of this project. I've mentioned before that community priorities have informed the collection of the different data resources that we've been pulling together. And also community conversations have informed some of the novel data resources that we've been trying to pull into this estimation of the climate hazardscape. And so some examples of community engagement that we have conducted so far, we have a steering committee that is composed of key stakeholders from different community organizations, as well as the Department of Energy from the state of Massachusetts through their Office of Technical Assistance. And then also we have folks from the Cambridge Health Alliance who participate in our steering committee. And this has been really helpful in terms of prioritizing the different areas that we should be focusing on, both in our community engagement as well as in the presentation of these different data resources, making them accessible to different community members. We are starting up in summer of 2024 our discussions, focus group interviews, and qualitative data collection with particular stakeholders in the region that we would like to engage, including certified community health workers, clinicians, extending our work with municipal staff, and also continuing to collaborate with community organizations. We're hoping that another key component within our mapping activities will be participatory mapping sessions. So once we've generated some of these data dashboards and other visualization tools that we would like to share with our communities in order to enable their different projects and resource allocation, that the processes that they're going through, we're hoping to gain feedback from the community through these participatory mapping sessions to understand if the lived experiences of the members of our community match with how we're characterizing exposures within our research projects. And we've also conducted a review of gray literature. One of the other pieces of feedback that we've gotten from communities is that there is a lot of research fatigue in these different communities. And so we're trying to identify the priority areas through the conversations, new conversations with the communities, as well as identifying what areas of priority they've already pulled together in previous work. We are also working on a project to web scrape existing policy resources from all of the different communities in the region. One of the things that I think is something that I'm learning about and something that we're all grappling with in this project is that each of these 21 different cities that are in the Mystic River watershed may have their own policy documentation, their own prioritization of the hazards of concern. And of course, as we on the academic and climate, specifically climate and health side of the research world know, the exposures don't respect the same boundaries of city and place. And so what we're trying to do is identify all of these policy resources across all of the different 21 communities and bring them together into one repository where we can start to identify the common concerns across these different communities and bring those into our work. Next slide. I think that is the end of the ACRES presentation. So happy to continue answering questions.
So I think there have been questions posted in the chat. Maybe I'll just give 30 seconds if anybody else has a question in the group. And if not, I'll keep moving us along. So I think Ian Suwing, are you next?
Sure, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to the folks at CC Run for having me. It's great to be here. It's great to talk to everyone. This is a bit of a different kind of talk. I am professor of Earth and Environment at Boston University. I'm an environmental economist, and I use empirical methods to characterize what might happen in the face of a warming climate. And the work I'm going to talk about today is work in process, and it's with my PhD student, Nicola Schneider. He's the one who actually does all of the quantitative work. But it's using data sets of opportunity to try to understand something about how we might adapt and how we might use energy to adapt to changes in temperature that climate change might portend. Next slide, please. And so the backstory of the entire work is this picture. We use energy in response to changes in weather to achieve thermal comfort. And if you think back to the first slide that Professor Wellenius showed, the increases in morbidity and mortality from some minimum temperature, energy shows the same pattern. And indeed, it is because energy and health are in some ways substitutes for one another. As we, exceed or fall short of a set point temperature down on the bottom, that is the point at which our thermostat clicks off space conditioning systems, we use more and more energy. We use more and more energy on the right-hand side of the graph to cool ourselves in high temperature exceedances from this comfortable temperature. And we use more and more energy to warm ourselves as temperatures get colder and fall below that comfortable temperature. With a warming climate, though, what that means is this U or V shape that we see in mid and high latitude regions of the world, that's going to give rise to two effects, and two effects across two different seasons. On the one hand, because with warming temperatures, cold season temperatures are actually going to be warmer, we're going to actually need less heating. And so we have effect A, which is a reduction in heating demand, while seasonally during hot seasons, the rightward shift in the temperature distribution is going to mean we're probably in hot seasons going to have a lot more demand for cooling and increases in energy. That's effect B. The big question that folks like myself who study integrated assessment and empirical analysis of the impacts of climate change focus on, the big question we're trying to get at is A greater than, equal to, or less than B? Because if B, the increase, exceeds A, the decrease, it's going to depend critically upon how we choose to generate that extra energy that makes it into the spaces we inhabit. If we choose to generate that extra energy by fossil fuel means, we're going to have higher emissions. And all of a sudden, we're making the problem that we're adapting to worse, which is kind of the definition of a bad dynamic. Next slide, please. There's copious evidence for that picture across a variety of spatial scales. I just provide a smattering of the empirical evidence here. But one thing that you see is that if you blur your eyes and look at the patterns, most of the evidence comes from electricity. Second, virtually all of the evidence comes from empirical measurements at aggregated spatial scales. The finest is Max Aufhammer's paper in Journal of Environmental Economics and Management on the top right, which looks at zip codes. Many of these data, papers by myself included, focus on countries. And so we don't have a good idea of what this looks like down at the scale of the individuals and households' lived experience of adaptation and dealing with heat. The closest is the bottom right, which is a paper by Staffel that actually uses simulated data for buildings. Next slide, please. But what we want to do is to bring together different kinds of data across scales to answer two questions. The first is at city scales, like New York City, and this paper focuses on New York, how are cities going to adapt to temperature shifts by adjusting their consumption of energy? And so we want to see at these aggregated spatial scales, like the scale of cities, a former paper by my graduate student, and Aufhammer's paper at zip codes, how representative is that down at the level where people are actually paying their bills and heating and cooling the spaces that they inhabit? And also, when you have building simulations, there are well-known limitations of those simulations, partly to do with the fact that they're engineering schema that don't adequately model people's behavior and their incentives. Given those, how consistent are the data sets that are being produced by running statistical regressions on building level simulation data as if it were were actual recorded data. And then when you scale up from buildings, how does the demography of not just structures, but the economic activities that those structures encompass, how does that affect the compositional response of cities to a changing climate? And that gets us to the second, which is the question I think that lots of policymakers want to try to understand, and I think will hopefully be interesting to this group, which is what's going to happen? What are the implications of empirical building energy consumption profiles for shifts in electricity and gas demands as we try to adapt to shifts in temperatures, and will the reduction in heating energy use be outweighed eventually by the increase in electricity use? And does this give rise to a mitigation adaptation trade-off? Does our adaptation in places where most of the people in the world live threaten to undermine our attempts to mitigate the problem that we're adapting to? Next slide, please. So our analytical approach is to leverage the promise of municipal energy disclosure ordinances. These have popped up across the United States over the past decade. New York was the first. The goal of these ordinances is to provide information as regulation, encouragement by publishing where you are in a roster of your peers and competitors. And those data form our primary data source. The City of New York has been excellent in putting out data on monthly electricity and gas consumption, aggregating bills at the level of buildings. So we have data on 23,000 buildings over 3 years under Local Law 84. The challenge with empirical analysis with these sorts of data sets is that cities are small. And the large-scale properties of the atmosphere means that the environmental treatments that are faced by very heterogeneous individuals and consumers and building types threaten to be the same. So if you have a statistical regression, you have a lot of variation on the left-hand side, but very limited variation on the right. To overcome this, we use a very, very large data set, for which I have to publicly thank Professor Hutyra for turning me on to. It's a 4-kilometer gridded temperature data set called CONUS 404, which downscales another European project, and it gives you on 4-kilometer grid hourly temperatures going back for many, many decades. What we're able to do is we're able to take individuals, buildings, distances from the centroids of those grids and use an inverse distance weighting scheme to synthetically endow each of the buildings, each of our 23,000 buildings, with its own individualized temperature series. And we can put that in a statistical regression where we can aggregate up over the period where the buildings recorded bills. We can aggregate up the number of hours below the set point and the number of hours above the set point multiplied by how far above or how far below the set point there were. These are metrics called heating and cooling degree hours, and put those in a statistical regression. The promise of that approach is not just to come up with treatment effects or exposure response functions given by the F and the G, those flexible splines, which are of the kind that Professor Wellenius showed in his work for health, but to actually take those forward and combine those with climate model simulations to understand what might be happening in the future at the scale of the individual buildings, and then use the demographic composition of buildings and activities to scale that up to the level of cities. And New York is a wonderful place to do it because there you see the data to be able to do this. The data that we're going to use is downscaled in time and space, climate model output through the Hyperfacets project funded by the US Department of Energy, who also funds my work. And that provides 12-kilometer gridded climate rasters out to 2100. Next slide, please. And so what do we see in terms of the actual data? The top picture shows the distribution across months of the year for which we have billing data of what temperatures look like in the historical period of the data set that's shown in blue. And overlapping that and with exceedances, what we see is in a high warming scenario, what that trace of hourly temperatures would look like at 2050. And so we do see the pattern of increased warming in both winter and summer. And That's what's going to drive our offsetting effects. But the nature of the offsetting effects are going to differ because of the building demography and building composition and where those buildings are in terms of what weather treatments they face. That's shown in the bottom. So you can see across New York City quite large differences in the composition in the LL84 data set of commercial versus residential versus manufacturing, and that's going to play into what our estimates look like. Next slide, please. So just quickly in terms of the results, what you see is a very similar pattern estimated similar to Max Aufhammer's work, declining with increasing heat exposures of gas consumption shown in the blue, and this U-shaped exposure response function of electricity use in the red. And it's the interplay between those two across different locations in the city, Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and different types of activities, commercial, manufacturing, and residential, that's going to ultimately give us our results. Next slide, please. When we take those fitted responses, those smooth fourth-order polynomials, and then combine them with the same data set that was used to estimate them, but shifted with a climate delta that represents from hyperfacets how temperatures on an hourly scale at 12 kilometers are going to change across the urban area. This is what you get. And here's the punchline of the picture that I showed. What you see is this quite substantial increase in the demand for electricity during summer, and a slight decrease in the demand for gas, leading to an increase in the total demand for energy during summer. For winter, both electricity and gas demands decrease, causing a decrease in total energy demand. And when you add those up over hot and cold seasons, plus the shoulder seasons, what you see is you sort of come out just a little on the positive side of a dead heat. You see a very slight increase in total energy consumption, and that's to the tune across our sample of 23,000 buildings of about just about 2 million or 2 billion BTU over the course of the year. We're in the process, and this work is work in process, we're in the process of scaling this up to from the 23,000 to the about 1.7 million buildings in New York City, and also looking at the carbon content of the electricity that was produced over time to see whether or not we come out ahead or behind in terms of New York City's imputed emissions. Stay tuned. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. There is one comment in the questions and answers. If anybody wants to post, we have time for maybe one question. Just sort of like great presentations, and referring to this library at Drexel where some of the things that everybody has shared are getting posted. So thank you for that. Any questions from anybody? Okay, then I'm going to share our last presentation, which is Lucy. And Emma, if you can share again so we've got one more presentation and questions, and then we're wrapping up. Thank you for everybody who's stayed for the full 2 hours. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for sticking it out. Going last is a tricky spot to go, so I really appreciate everyone being here. I am not a health scientist. I am one of those geoscientists that loves to collaborate with environmental health scientists. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to share with you some work that we are just getting ready to submit, and I'd love comments and feedbacks because this is still work in process in the beginning of what I hope is a number of analyses. So my group, in particular, Ian Smith, who's a postdoc in my lab, we've been working on statistical approaches to estimate higher resolution temperatures for cities. Next slide, Emma. So Last year, we published a paper where we looked at the land surface temperature at the census block scale and estimated how surface temperatures change as a function of urban form. In particular, what we saw is if you can increase by 1% the amount of tree cover that you have in your city, you can reduce temperatures. And this maybe is not the most novel finding that trees cool cities, but what is novel in this analysis is to look at exactly how much cooling we were able to observe for a unit change in tree cover and how that amount of cooling varied across cities. We similarly looked at how much grass cover there was, which cooled while also green less efficiently than trees. Buildings and paved roads warmed urban temperatures. And then we see a really large effect from variations in what the surface albedo or the reflectivity of the urban surface looks like. And next slide. And I just want to point out the mechanisms that are in play for these two key cooling approaches with tree cover. Next slide. When you have trees present, you increase the amount of shade, which reduces the incident radiation that is hitting the surface and hitting people. It's reducing the amount of heat that gets stored into the built infrastructure. Next. The other piece, the other mechanism through which trees cool is through evaporative cooling, which is taking liquid water from the ground, having it move through the structure of the tree and be evaporated through the pores of the tree, converting from a liquid to a gas phase and consuming heat. So both of these mechanisms are in play, and the context for where the tree is growing, whether it's in a hot, humid place or in a dry, hot place or in a not so hot place, drives some of the differences that we see in the cooling efficiency of trees. The other mechanism that we've been focusing on next is how much change we could get in local temperatures if we modify the surface albedo, the surface reflectivity. And this is an image of a census block, a city block in Boston. And you can see that in this case, the potential to add trees to cool is pretty limited, and it's a pretty built out city scene, but the temperatures in this space could be modified fairly easily because of the low sloped nature of the built infrastructure here. Next, Emma. Where this is another satellite image where you could see that the surface albedo was changed in this case with a roof coating that was applied to this roof. So we've been thinking a lot about how we know that these mechanisms work. We know something about why and how they work, but how do we come up with better estimates of how much cooling we could actually get with interventions like these in our cities? So this is a bit of the earlier work that we did focused on land surface temperature. And land surface temperature is great because we have a lot of satellite data to measure it across the globe, but it's not a very intuitive metric. It's not one that's related to health outcomes, and it's not one that's really easily communicated with the public to understand how much mitigation potential there is. Next slide. So what we've been working on for the last year is a manuscript that will hopefully get submitted in the next week or two. And this is led by my postdoc, Ian Smith, where we've been working on statistical approaches to downscale air temperature estimates. And we're next going to be working on humidity estimates. But the concept of the model that we've built is to start out with a coarse scale resolution data product. So in this case, the leftmost image of the Boston area that you see is from the DayMet model. So this is a 1 kilometer min-max estimate of temperature that's available for the United States going back for decades. This drives a lot of our climate and ecosystem models. And 1 kilometer is not granular enough, and twice daily is not really granular enough to support some of the analyses and assessment of interventions that we've been interested in. So what we've done is we've started with this regional weather estimate from an existing modeling product, we've brought in additional station data, and then we've brought in what the land cover characteristics surrounding that station look like. So in our modeling domain, which in this case is Southern New England, we have about 160 stations that we've used to train the model, and then about 100 urban weather stations that we've focused on for validation. And what we've been able to do is downscale these coarse regional estimates of temperature down to 200-meter hourly resolution. And in that downscaling approach, we've included we've structured the model such that we can estimate how much a change in albedo or a change in tree cover will influence what that local temperature looks like. In the right-hand set of graphs and panels, which are hopefully big enough for you to be able to decipher, we show what the model performance looks like. So predicted versus observed temperature for all summer hours is in the top left panel. And you can see that we have no meaningful bias in our model and have an overall R-squared of 0.91 and a root mean square error on our estimate of about 1.48 degrees. Model performance improves midday. So if we look in the morning, our root mean square error decreases to 1.3. And if we look in the afternoon, it's also 1.3. In the last lower right diel cycle shows you the hourly difference in our estimated average observed versus predicted temperatures. So this is great. We've built a model that takes an existing temperature reanalysis product, and we've been able to downscale it using a model structure that allows us to play with what possible urban form might be. And that's exactly what we've done. Next slide, Emma. So we've focused on the city of Boston for our case study, and what we did is we brought together a lot of heterogeneous data, and we ran some scenarios to estimate the feasibility, cost, and potential to mitigate urban heat with these sorts of albedo or tree planting interventions. In the top left panel, it shows one of our pixels, and you can see that the black delineated roofs are low slope, flat, black rubber roofs that dominate the cityscape of Boston. You could see 2 and a little bit white roofs in this particular slide, in this particular pixel. And then there are a handful, looks like 7 or 8 sloped roofs like you'd tend to see in more suburban locations. And what we've done is we've used high resolution albedo estimates to say, well, what if instead of having a reflectivity in the neighborhood of 0.1 or 0.15, what if we took that reflectivity to the neighborhood of 0.5 or 0.6, and we estimated using the distribution of observed white roof albedos in the city of Boston, new albedos, to run a scenario for how much cooling we might be able to achieve. The cost of converting a flat black rubber roof to a cool roof, the city of Boston estimates to be about $70 per square meter. So for some of our cost estimates, we took the city's estimates for that. We similarly looked at what the current distribution of tree cover looked like in the city, and that's in the lower left panel. And we identified where all of the natural ground, this means not paved ground that does not currently have trees, was located. And we also identified where empty tree pits were located. And we planted all empty tree pits and all natural ground to have trees located in it. We required some buffer distance within the natural ground away from buildings to try to have a little bit of realism there. The city of Boston's estimated cost for planting a tree is $2,024, and so we took that in our cost estimate, and we did not include the cost of maintenance, but it is a very real cost that that needs to be considered. So this is the basis for the scenarios that we were going to run, where we modified albedo and trees. Next slide, Emma. One of the other things that we wanted to think about was, where do we need some of the changes most acutely? And so we've calculated an index to identify priority intervention locations where we take an equal weighting between the population density, so how many people are located there that would potentially benefit from this intervention. Vulnerability, in this case, we took the CDC Social Vulnerability Index and looked at what is the capacity, a metric of what is the capacity of people to be able to deal with this extreme heat. And then we looked at the amount of excess heat that was present in different parts of the city. So in this case, we took the number of excess hours that we estimated from our downscaled model where temperatures exceeded 24 degrees C. And so you could see that some parts of the city have much higher excess heat. And so we put these together. Next slide. And we produced an estimate of where we have some of the highest weighted excess heat vulnerability. And so in the pinks that you see in these maps, the areas that are darker have higher population vulnerability and excess heat. And what we did is we actually, in this optimization exercise, we took the annual budget for the City of Boston's Park Department, which is $34 million, less than 1% of the budget, the City of Boston's budget. And we started to spend money in the ways that I described, where we went to the areas that had some of the highest need in terms of this excess heat exposure. And we looked at what was possible as far as intervention solutions. So if there was space available to plant trees, if there were low slope flat roofs that were available for conversion, we started to execute these interventions until we ran out of our specified budget. And you can see that one part of the city that really lit up in Boston is East Boston, which in the top right panel, you can see that most of the solutions that came into play in that part of the city were related to cool roofs. And that's because there was very little space available to plant trees. There were some spots where there was bare ground available to plant trees, but most of this area was dominated by buildings. And so the building interventions came out as some of the most important. In the lower right-hand panel is an estimate from our model for how much air temperature could change as a result of having these interventions put in place. And so we estimate that we could have about a 0.75 degree C reduction in air temperature in some of the in the East Boston area with these sorts of interventions. And I could say a lot more, but our hope here is that we've developed an approach for downscaling temperature to a granular scale that can help support decision-making, as well as structured a model that can explore the possibilities for how to most effectively cool our cities.
Great, thank you, Lucy. Perfect slide to end on. So I want to thank everybody, all of my colleagues at the Center on Climate and Health, for really amazing talks. I will also say to the audience that's here still, as you can see, we're a pretty collaborative bunch. So if there's anything that sort of sparked your interest, is something that you want to collaborate on, talk more about, ask for resources, etc., please email anybody on the slide. And I think with that, just sort of a big thank you to everyone, and I will turn it back to Franco.
Thanks, Patricia. That was an amazing sequence. I just want to thank you and all the speakers for putting that together. Of course, Nikki for coordinating, but just to see, how we talk about so much transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work, but just to see the sort of health data, the climate data, the human behavioral data, the land use data, the climate science, spatial mapping, big data, optimization, all of this sort of coming together is really actually encouraging, just to see all the progress. And I just, from it's also encouraging. I think some of the findings that were discussed here and there throughout the presentations are sort of resonating with studies that I've read in other places, and maybe there is a chance that we're sort of coming to some sort of first principles about adaptation planning, or some sort of consensus about the scale of the problem and the scale of the solutions that are needed. So just very encouraging, very exciting set of presentations. So thanks, a big thanks to all of you. And with that, we are approaching the hour. I'll just remind our attendees, if you like what you saw today, please do rejoin us again. We're going to take the month of July off from the CC Run seminar series because we would be right around the July 4th weekend. We will be back in August, and we'll announce in August an exciting sequence in the fall as well. Of presentations that we'll be continuing with, but please enjoy your summer and join us sort of towards the end in August. And thanks, one last thanks to everybody here for a really stimulating session today. Thanks, everybody.